Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of this team building fundamentals video series, and this is my attempt to try and help impart some experience and knowledge from my part into helping you learn some core fundamentals of team building with any sort of format. And in this episode, we're switching gears to the defensive side of team building and talking about switching potential and specifically how to kind of build into it. My name is Tyler. I sometimes go by Atacross online, and let's hop right in. First, what is switch potential? What I describe it as is, or define it as, is a Pokemon's potential to switch into a particular attack or attacks with little to no risk. So, for example, Fairy-type Pokemon switching into a Dragon-type move has very high switch potential because they are immune to Dragon moves. So it's no damage, which is really good. Or, for example, a Water-type switching into a Fire-type move. It can receive very little damage, which gives it high switch potential, especially if it's a bulkier Water-type. Then it's like even less damage, potentially. So that's the idea of switch potential. And getting a little bit into like how you create it is by having Pokemon on your team with good type synergy, and that's to say that you have Pokemon that basically resist each other's weaknesses or resist each other's attacks. And you want to have this because if you have 4 Pokemon weak to dark type attacks and no resistances to dark, you have no Pokemon that can probably very reliably switch into dark type moves, and that's really bad, especially in this early 2023 format because there's a lot of dark types. And so that creates bad switch potential overall for your team because you're not switching. If you come up against someone with dark type moves, they're going to see that and just like freely attack with dark type moves, knowing that they're hitting something at least neutrally. So, and the way to sort of combat that is by having a team core of Pokemon. And it's usually a trio of Pokemon where they're like strong against each other and resisting each other. So there's like this kind of triangular nature. And the best example of this is the common Fire, Water, Grass core. So they all resist each other going one way, and then they're strong against each other going the other way. So, for example, Fire weak to Water, Water weak to Grass, Grass weak to Fire. And then go the other way. Fire resists grass, grass resists water, water resists fire. So because they have this sort of like nature to them that typically anything else you come up against, you have like any of those particular types that these are weak against, you have something to switch into. So if you have your fire type out and there's a water type out threatening it, you should ideally have a grass or water type Pokemon to switch into that potential water attack. Another common example is Fairy Steel Dragon, where Fairy strong against Dragon, but Steel resists Fairy. Steel also resists Dragon. Steel also resists the things that are strong against Fairy, which is Steel and Poison. Dragon resists Fire, which is strong against Steel. And it gets more complicated when you have dual typings, but you can kind of see how it works, how like the relationship with the typings is the main thing you're wanting to think about. And that is and by having that strong relationship, that's where you have good, strong switching potential. And that's what you really want. And again, to have that is you have Pokemon that are very easily able to switch into another Pokemon's weakness and then resisting that instead. So that's what I mean by when I talk about switch potential. And we'll get more into type synergy and cores a little bit. But first, I wanted to touch on the good and the bad of switching, because obviously when talking about switch potential, that involves the actual act of switching a Pokemon out to bring in another Pokemon. So obviously the reason you do that is for a good purpose. Like typically you want to reposition yourself into a better situation. So again, like your fire type Pokemon staring in front of a faster water type that's going to knock you out. That can be a bad position, especially if that fire type is really important to winning the late game. So you switch it out and put something in that has a better matchup and potentially is also threatening the water type. So you're taking a bad position and trying to reposition yourself into a better position. That's kind of the main reason to switch. It can also stall turns out. So like if your opponent has Tailwind up, you can use switches to kind of stall that out in a way. to where they don't get the most out of their Tailwind, or if Trick Room is up, you can make it so they don't get the most out of it by making them waste their strong attacks into Pokemon that resist those strong attacks. Another cool thing about switching is it's a way to maintain momentum. And what I mean by that is it's like you have your opponent in a tough position, but you keep them in a tough position by like switching one of your Pokemon out. So kind of the flip side where like instead of getting yourself out of a bad position to a good position, you're in a good position but you want to stay in that good position, because if you could say like your opponent's going to do something, like they're going to pull a switch that's going to get them into a better position, but you can pull a switch in anticipation of that to then still be in that good position, and you're like maintaining that what we call momentum, which could be another video in and of itself. So but again, as good as switching is, there's always drawbacks. And one of those drawbacks is, when you're switching out, you're giving up a turn for that slot to be doing damage. And instead, it's just taking damage almost for free. And so I put free in quotes because it's free damage in the sense that like they didn't have to really work for that damage. You just switch something and take the damage. But it could be you're like giving them a little bit of damage for something better in the long run. But there's times where that damage could be bad at the moment or whatnot. So you have to trade off, like, is me switching into this attack and taking damage, is that going to be good, or is that going to be okay? Is that going to be negligible? It's never really good to take damage. Like, you don't want to take damage, but you can't escape that. But is it okay to take this damage? Because the good of repositioning will outweigh the bad thing about my opponent getting that damage off. And then also, again, because switching is passive, since you're giving up a turn, you're potentially creating an opportunity for your opponent to use a setup move, especially if they're expecting a switch. So like they think you're going to switch out, so they have no reason not to just press Sword Stance on their Garchomp, because it's like whatever you switch into now is going to take double damage next turn, even if it's resisted or neutral. So there's that trade-off. But again, as bad as it is for them to set up, is what you're switching in going to try and make up for that bad, because it could be even better to reposition to where even if they do set up, you can manage it better, as opposed to them just sitting there and either setting up and you being in an even worse spot, or them just attacking and losing your Pokemon or something that's weak to Garchomp. So that's the bad part, but the long-term good can at least outweigh the bad. And then on the flip side, you can waste your valuable turns of Trick Room or Tailwind if you're benefiting from them, because like the point of setting up Trick Room or Tailwind is to have a speed advantage to then just fire off damage. But if you're wasting turns switching, again, you're switching out, you're wasting a turn for that slot to be putting out damage. You are like wasting that turn. Like you could be, when that could be a valuable turn of attacking. And sometimes you have to do it. Like you're just in a position where like you're not going to get the most out of the last two turns of Trick Room if you don't waste this one turn now. So again, there's a bad thing. But there's a trade-off that where you're trying to take the long-term good over the short-term bad. So just to put that out there to think about, like when you're switching and when you're building for switch potential. And this is also kind of an argument for like why it's good to be thinking about how well you can switch into attacks for your Pokemon. Okay, let's talk about actually building it into a team. So we talked about defensive cores, and I already talked about the common defensive cores: Fire, Water, Grass, Fairy, Steel, Dragon. Again, it can get more complicated when you have dual types, and there are and you're not restricted to just these three. These are just really easy ones to come up with. But the main point is that you have switch-ins for, you have a Pokemon and then you have a switch-in for it. So that's just what you need to be doing, thinking about it in terms of like multiple Pokemon. And speaking of which, one good way to think about that is like, what are your offensive Pokemon? What Pokemon are like usually your keys to winning a game that are doing the most damage, since knocking out Pokemon's the goal. Think about what that Pokemon's weak to, and then get like a bulky Pokemon that switches into their weaknesses really well. That way you can conserve that Pokemon for that later damage dealing that will win the game ultimately. So for example, if you're using Hydreigon, make sure to have a Fairy resistance or a Dragon resistance, so a Steel type's really good, because it resists both those, that you can switch in, because if there's something threatening Hydreigon, that Hydreigon either can't knock out or is outsped by, like you switch into that to try and put yourself into a position where you can clear that Pokemon threatening Hydreigon, or you can take care of it for the late game to be in a better position. Same with like fire resistance, or you have your Goldengo and there's a fire type threatening you, so you need to switch out Goldengo into a fire resistance. So have a Pokemon that resists fire for that reason. Because again, typically offensive Pokemon are your keys to victory, so protect them with switches. And I also say Pokemon that you're kind of using as your primary switch in, try and use bulkier Pokemon. Because like they still have to take damage, and sometimes even resisted damage can be a lot. So for example, Meowscarada is a grass type, but it's not like the bulkiest Pokemon, so a really strong water move could still do a lot of damage, especially if you're like switching Meowscarada into like a rain boosted water move or something. So like try and use bulkier Pokemon as your primary switches. You can definitely build your cores with not just bulky Pokemon. So like you look at the example to the left with Skeledirge, Azumarill, Mungus, that's a good defensive core. They're all bulky, but you don't necessarily have to do that. That's like the safest way, but you can still absolutely do that with like a Meowscarada, Azumarill, Skeledirge, depending on the rest of your team. So bulky Pokemon, really good. Learn important damage calcs. I cannot stress this enough, just in general. When you're building a serious team to try and make a serious run at a tournament, learn damage calcs. Like, take notes when you're practicing to get a feel for your team. Take notes on what kind of damage calcs you think you need to know, because that can go such a long way when you're making a switch. So you at least, especially if you're switching into neutral attacks, like neutral damage, not resisted damage, you can have an idea of like, okay, I'm going to take this much damage, but that's okay because the long run is better. I can take that hit and still be okay. I'll go back to the Meowscarada thing where like, okay, I'm switching Meowscarada into this resisted hit. It's still going to do a pretty decent amount because it's really strong, but because I resisted, I'll survive it, and that's all I need. I just need to survive it. Knowing that is really important. Or just like knowing in general, like, okay, I'm going to switch into this neutral hit, but I can survive it, which is fine. Or I'm going to switch into this resisted hit. I can take it like 3 more times and still be fine. So knowing those calcs is so important. Learn those when you're building your team, and you can also learn how to make proper adjustments to make your switching in life better. Okay, so I'm going to go to 2 examples real quick to kind of show this playing out when you're building that. So like to kind of again just show like why thinking about switching is really important and building into potential switches. So okay, so we're gonna say this is a hypothetical lead, turn 1 lead situation. I've led Azumarill, Mungus into a Meowscarada and Sylveon. This is not a good position for me because 1, Meowscarada just threatens a KO onto Azumarill with Flower Trick. And Amoonguss can't redirect the Flower Trick because Rage Powder doesn't work on grass types, and so that's a problem. That's a bad position. On the top of that, even more, Sylveon's Hyper Voice is a spread move, so even if I Rage Powder, like it's gonna hit Azumarill anyway. So Azumarill's really threatened here. So the ideal thing is to look into switching out Azumarill. Fortunately, I have an Arcanine in the back because that's fortunate because it resists both grass and fairy. And if my opponent is predicting the switch and they go for like knockoff, Arcanine still takes neutral damage, loses its item, but it's less damage because it's also going to be intimidating Meowscarada. So pulling that switch, or knowing that I have like built my Arcanine into this specifically to protect Azumarill, because this Azumarill could be really important for later in the match. So what we want to do is pull that switch. Here's another interesting facet. Amoonguss, because we have this Fire, Water, Grass core, Amoonguss isn't threatened by the Meowscarada very much because it resists its primary attack, Flower Trick. Amoonguss also happens to be a poison type, which resists Fairy, so Hyper Voice is not doing a lot. So Amoonguss, even though Azumarill's on a bad spot, we have Amoonguss available to kind of do something to help reposition ourselves. And a couple options are we can Spore into the Sylveon, so it has a dead turn at next turn, and guaranteed, and then possibly 2 more turns, which could be really valuable. Or if we're running the move Pollen Puff, we could go after the Meowscarada with Pollen Puff and weaken it to where if Arcanine has extreme speed, it can just pick it off. while then Amoonguss is going for Spore into the Sylveon, because now Sylveon's not really doing much here. Same with like a Meowscarada, other than like knocking off maybe. So that's an example of how like you had a bad situation for one of your Pokemon, so you're kind of repositioning into a more favorable position, while also taking advantage of a somewhat like I'd say neutral position with Amoonguss. So that's the first example of kind of like repositioning into a better situation. Let's look at an example of how we can like maintain momentum. So here's a purely hypothetical example of we have Rotomosh and our Fire Paldean Tauros up against an Armarouge and a Gholdengo. So in this situation, what we have is the Rotom Wash is threatening the KO on Armarouge with Hydro Pump, which is really significant because Armarouge could knock out Tauros, except that the that Rotom and Tauros are both faster than that, and Tauros is threatening the Gholdengo. And Gholdengo's in a weird spot because even its like main move, Make It Rain, is resisted by both this like water and fire type. So it's pretty safe to just go for the Hydro Pump into the Armarouge. However, we know there's a Gastrodon potentially as a possible switch in for my opponent, because they could pull the switch to reposition themselves, because if you don't know, the Gastrodon gets the ability Storm Drain, which would redirect the water move into it and boost its special attack, which would then allow Armarouge to potentially just knock out the Tauros. But we also have a Pokemon in the back, because we have that Fire Water Grass Core. We have our Meowscarada in the back. And if we're really anticipating the Gastrodon switch-in, we can proactively attempt to counteract that by switching Tauros out into Meowscarada, because we pretty much expect that's going to switch in and redirect the Hydro Pump, which then allows the Armarouge to take out the Tauros. So we're going to proactively switch Meowscarada in, which has a great matchup against the Gastrodon, and it's also a Dark type, so it does take no damage from the incoming Psychic move. So that's a big Ripperoonie for Armarouge. So it's kind of a null turn, but even though no damage happened, it kept our strong position being strong. And now we have Tauros in the back to deal with the Gholdengo in the back later. And this Gastrodon's heavily threatened by Meowscarada, and once Gastrodon's gone, then Rotom can take out the Armarouge. So in that sort of like hypothetical scenario, that's where having like the good switch potential is good, because even though like we know that they had good switch potential with the Gastrodon, we kind of anticipated that, and we knew we could like switch Meowscarada pretty easily, unless the opponent went for a crazy read and attacked with a fire move, which that can happen. But at least you're building options for yourself into those situations. You had the option to counteract that Gastrodon coming in and ruining Rotom's dream of knocking out this Armarouge, because we proactively built that into the team to cover that. So, well, hopefully that kind of helped you guys think more about how to proactively build in switching potential into your team. I think switching is one of the most crucial things in Pokemon, both singles and doubles. But knowing like how you're going to do it before you even get to the battle is really helpful, especially if you're aware of the meta threats and what your Pokemon are weak to, and you have Pokemon that can cover those weaknesses by pulling a timely switch and then capitalizing off the new position going into the next turn. So anyways, guys, thanks for watching. Dogs are freaking out right at the end, of course. Oh well. Thanks for watching. Hope you found this guide helpful. Be sure to like and subscribe, and suggest any other guides you'd like to see. We will catch you in the next one. See ya.